Good morning. Over the last couple of weeks, I have been captured by a study. And bear with me, the beginning of this is going to get a little heavy, and then it'll lighten up, I promise. The church in the West, for the better part of 15 years, has been dying. Post-COVID, it's the lowest it's been, especially in the United States. And I was so anxious to figure out why. So I listened to everyone I could talk to, all these guys who are like supposed to be church experts and all of that, and I studied and studied and studied and studied, and at the end of it all, you know what I found? A whole bunch of people pointing to the world. Every preacher person had their own way of saying it, but basically it was this. It's those people out there that are killing the church. It's the agenda, it's the media, it's all of these different entities. But when I returned to Scripture, what I found was fascinating. For even the gates of hell cannot rise against it. Therefore, if the church is dying, I was left with an uncomfortable conclusion. If the church is dying, there's only one force that can kill it. And that's us. Tonight, this morning, I would like to lead you guys through an autopsy. An autopsy of a dying church. And I'd like us to consider two major things. It's not hard. But I want us to consider first why we're here and what we're doing. And the second is who we're doing it for. And by answering these very simple questions, I think we'll find ourselves challenged profoundly. In the beginning of this, for the first couple of minutes, oh man, I have to do slides, I'm terrible at that. For the first couple of minutes, we're going to be doing a lot of review, things that everyone in this room knows, and that's okay. But as we go through, we're going to cycle deeper and deeper and deeper. Until eventually, I hope that we walk out of here being legitimately challenged. This is one of those sermons I feel like should have a disclaimer. This is going to be a little uncomfortable for all of us. It's like that doctor's appointment where I'm standing in front of the doctor and they're looking at me going, "You eat what? Every day?" It's like one of those moments. It's going to be important for all of us to hear, but very difficult for all of us to listen. Let's start here with the basic foundational truth that we need to know going into this. As we perform this autopsy, first we need to remember that we are the kingdom of God. But the problem is, so many people have so many different views of God. Who exactly he is, what exactly he looks like, and how he functions. In Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, the Hebrews writer says probably the most profound thing in the entire book. Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature. What is this passage saying? Very simply, for thousands of years, people tried to write about God. They tried to understand God. They tried to talk about God. But what came out on the other side of the veil was warped. But Jesus came and removed that veil. And in the person of Jesus Christ, for the first time in human history, we see exactly who God is. Some of us view the Bible like a picture book, that you can flip to any page and there's pictures of God. Some written by Moses, some by David, some by Jeremiah, some by Ezekiel. And then there's Jesus. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that Jesus is the singular revelation of God, not one among many. And everything you need to know about Jesus Christ, or everything you need to know about God the Father, you see in the person of Jesus Christ and how he lived, more specifically, how he died. The entirety of God seen in one man, Christ. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is going to be the world's most boring sermon, because we've heard this before. But I want us to stop for just a second and think about what that means. If God truly is fully Jesus, then how does that radically change the way we view ourselves, the world around us, and God himself? Let's consider for a moment what this revelation of Jesus revealed to us. There we go. Okay. Let's see what it revealed to us. We're going to be flying through some passages here I don't expect you guys to We're not going to stop and read every one. They'll just be in the background as I'm talking. If you want to see what I'm talking about, they're behind me. First, we see that Jesus coming to earth revealed that he came down to earth out of the premise of love. That was exclusively his rationale. He came for love. Not only that, but he came to reveal a life of love. Everything he did in his incarnation, everything he did was for others, to demonstrate and reveal what a life of love looks like. Not only that, but John 15 reveals a stunningly beautiful image. As what we see is that God has always lived in this dance of love between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Constantly and for eternity loving each other. And halfway through the dance, Jesus came to earth to extend his hand out to invite us in. To that Trinitarian dance of love. We see that he came down out of love, to live a life of love, to reveal and extend love, to demonstrate God's love on the cross for the purpose of love, to die in an act of love, and to make us a family predicated on love. Love was it. Love was the point. Very simply. What Jesus Christ revealed about the nature of God is everything he did was for the motivation of love and for the rationale of love. It was the means and the method and the mode. It was all of it. Love was the singular thing that motivated Christ in all of his actions. And it was this love that was supposed to, well, change the world. But what's funny is when we come to Jesus, we all agree on that, don't we? I don't think anyone in here would argue that Jesus' primary objective on earth was love. That's something that we pretty much know. In fact, if you were to ask most people outside of the walls about Jesus, that's probably the first adjective that comes to mind is, well, God's love. We just sang a whole bunch of hymns about God's love, and there is a notebook pad with a list of all the songs about love that Dad was trying to choose from. Love and God's love is so centrally seen on Jesus, and yet it's somehow lost in translation as we go further away from the cross. We believe that Jesus came and revealed something completely and radically different. That before God was this God of the Old Testament about laws, rules, and instructions, and then somehow post-Jesus, now he's completely different, and he cares about grace and love and freedom. Well, God actually never changed, because God has always been what we saw in Jesus. Everything leading up to that, we were seeing through a veil. And in Jesus, we see the real thing. The entire old law, with all 526 of its laws, revolved around one very simple idea: love. In Romans chapter 13, verse 8 through 10, Paul, talking about the old law, said this: "Don't owe anything to anyone except the debt of mutual love. If you love your neighbor, you see, you have fulfilled the law. Commandments like don't commit adultery, don't kill, don't steal, don't covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to its neighbor. So love is the fulfillment of the law." Again, in another passage, Paul writes, for the whole law, the old law, the whole point of that part before Matthew was this: love your neighbor as yourself. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, I think Jesus says it best. No surprise there. "You must love the Lord your God," replied Jesus, "with all your heart and with all your life and with all your mind. And this is the first commandment, and it's the primary one. The second is like it, and it's this: you must love your neighbor as yourself." But listen to this part. The entire law and the prophets hang on this. The entirety of the Bible, from Genesis to Malachi, on the simple premise of love God and love man. See, nothing's new here. Jesus is who God is, and he always has been. And what's amazing is that when he came to earth, he tried first in the garden to create a universe of love. It didn't work. Sin entered in. So what did he do next? He created a people, the Israelites, and he was like, this is going to be my people of love. He did it out of love for the world, out of love for Israel, and through and for the purpose of, well, this is going to get repetitive real quick: love. And what's amazing about it is that when Israel was at its best, it remained in this principle of love. But you know what happened? It wasn't long before love wasn't enough. When Israel began to change their view. A God of love creating a covenant of love, predicated on love for the purpose of love, love no longer became central to Israel. And we see the prophets trying to constantly bring them back. Come back to this idea of love. Come back to this idea of love. Come back to this idea of love. And time again, the Israelites failed to do it. Until eventually, the Israel that went into exile was so much different than the Israel that was sitting at Mount Sinai before God. They had lost what? Love. And what's amazing is as we're doing this autopsy, as I was poring over the scriptures, trying to figure out what happened. Because, by the way, if we can learn from Israel's mistakes, we can probably avoid our own. And so as I'm going through and performing this, I'm reading, I'm studying, I'm researching what happened. Love became imbalanced because something else entered into the scale. To the Jews at first, it was rightness. This was very important to the Jews. So quickly it became everything about the entirety of what we know about God is on love and they kind of whispered this in at first, and our own rightness. And then all of a sudden, love and rightness became even. Problem was, it all hangs on the balance of love. When that balance goes out of whack, what happens? It all comes crumbling down. Then it was their own holiness. Israel was so predicated on making sure they looked different than the world. They weren't going to be like those slime. They were going to be themselves. And that caused them to, again, find an imbalance. God said love. They're like love, but also throw this on. And what ended up happening? Well, it all fell apart. And time again, anytime the Israelites turned away from the primary objective of love and added anything, even righteous things beside love, the balance went out. Because the whole law and all of the prophets hang on this. Love God and love each other. At the end of the autopsy, this is the Israelite people I found. Instead of love, they began to despise. Instead of caring for the poor and the weak, they began to oppress them. Instead of valuing the foreigner and the fatherless, the widow, Israel turned their back on him. And instead of caring to overturn injustice, they participated in the same structure. This was really hard for me to read. And it was really hard for me to read for two reasons. One, because it was like through the whole Bible, you see this desperation of God. Desperation of God. He does not like the way the world is right now. He's never liked the way the world is right now, and he desperately wants to change it, but he uses us to do it. And he understands something that the Israelites lost. It wasn't their holiness that could change the world. It wasn't their righteousness that could change the world. It was their sword that could change the world. It was their love that could change the world. And every single time they turned to the sword, their holiness, their righteousness, anything, they imbalanced love, and they failed. Until the people they became looked nothing like the Jesus that would come. The Jews, even at the end, even in exile, were saying things like, we are God's chosen people. They were claiming that they knew God. But then when Jesus literally came in front of them years later, they had no idea, because Jesus was so much different than what they had thought. Started with just love, became love, and until eventually by the time Christ came, that love part just dropped right off. It was all about holiness, righteousness, obedience, all good things, but imbalanced with love. I broke down this kind of fall apart into three categories, which we'll cover very quickly, Bishop, very quickly. We'll see. These three ideas that we're going to cover, kind of what happens when this imbalance of love occurs. And I want us to do two things with what we're reading. As we're reading this, as we're reading what happened to Israel, I want you personally to think of two things. One, how is the church aligning with that? If we're reading things that happened to Israel and there's alarm bells going off in your head of, whoa, that sounds familiar, that's a problem. But less corporately, more individually, if you're reading this and you find yourself going, wow, I do that. Let this be a reminder of where we are and where we need to be and the centrality of God's love. The first thing that happened is they lost their trust in the idea of love. So what did they do? Well, they're surrounded by Egypt, a superpower, a very, very, very influential place. And so what they ended up doing is assimilating kind of with the culture. The idea of love, the centrality of love is vastly, by the way, this is true always. The centrality of love, the power of love will always be rejected by the world. That's why God says, my wisdom is foolishness to man. Why is he saying that? Because he bases everything on love and we don't understand that. We cannot relate. But what Israel started to do is they looked around at Egypt and said, Egypt's a superpower. They're strong, they're powerful. And then their Pharaoh, their God king, they were like, that guy has got it going on. So what ended up happening is as Israel was imbalanced, they lost their focus on love, the centrality of love. God, Yahweh, started looking a lot more like Pharaoh than Jesus. Read the Old Testament and read some of the things that were being said about God. I mean, there are some really uncomfortable parts of the Bible. That whole passage about how God enjoys smashing babies against the rocks. Or that their sword is hungry for the blood of his enemies. That doesn't sound like Jesus. You know what that sounds like? Pharaoh. As their attention started veering away from love, they started looking like the world until their God looked like a king and not God. And then, surprise, surprise, they started looking like the Egyptians. There were moments of incredible reality where people would come from all over the world to see Israel. And they would go, wow, you guys are so much different than the rest of us because of their love. But by the end, God, in one of the most condemning statements at the end of Isaiah, says, for you are any other nation to me, Israel. Hosea, he says, you are not my children, and I from here on shall call you not my people. Why? Because they had lost their identity of love. As the people were trashing the name of God and viewing him in this negative light, mistaking the idea and this imbalance of love, God had this line to say, and it's one of the most haunting in the Bible. You have done these things, and I kept silent. So you thought I was just like you. But I will prove you wrong. And boy, did he ever, in the image of Jesus Christ. Second, not only did they mistake God in the light of the world, but they lost their identity of the loving and the loved, and became the condemning and the condemners. This, be honest here, this is the one that Bishop Darby struggles with, right? Maybe not you, maybe this is just for me, maybe in this room of 155 people, I'm the only one, but this one's hard. One of the things we're talking about in our teen class is really fun, is this idea of selfishness, and how intrinsically we as people have this prerequisite of thinking about ourselves all the time. We can't help it, right? I was making a joke in there that I wake up in the morning Bishop, so surprise, surprise, guess what Bishop thinks about first? Bishop. It's Bishop's brain. What can you expect? God asks us to redefine that, to change it. But one of the things that's really important is that God always primarily starts with the fact that you're loved before he ever expects you to love others. Let me say that again. That'll be important in a second. God always starts by reminding you that you're loved before he ever expects for you to love others. The reason why is because you have to be the loving before you can be the loved. You can only understand the value of someone else if you understand the value God gave you. Christians, a lot of times we struggle with this. We're all insecure. And we know the parts of us that no one else does, right? So the idea that we're loved is sometimes hard for us to fathom. And then surprise, surprise, we turn around and we're not able to love the world. Why? Because we don't really even understand the love that we have. Israel first started losing their own love, and they did this ironically in their righteousness. They forgot that they were loved. It all became about how good they could do it, how right they could keep the law, how important the sacrifices were. And they became obsessed with that to the point where they forgot the key point, that it was a relationship between him and God. Literally, covenant. The word covenant is a relationship between two people and a document that proves it. That's what this was all about. God and his children. But along the way, Israel got lost. They lost the balance of love and added other things to it, became obsessed with the other things, until eventually they woke up one morning and felt worthless and lost love. And when they lost the ability to love themselves, they lost the ability to love others. And so they condemned themselves. Why? Because I'm not doing it good enough. I keep making this mistake. I am not holding the law perfectly. It's on me. It's my fault. I'm bad. I'm evil. I'm wicked. So how does that manifest to the world? So are you. You're bad. You're wicked. You're a sinner. You're wrong. Makes sense. Perhaps no one exemplified this better than the Pharisees in the time of Jesus. Jesus basically looked at them and said, it would almost be better if you didn't go and convert people, because you're converting them to hell, not heaven. Completely lost the point of love and focused on the wrong details. Man, coffee's cold. Finally, they lost the eyes that valued people and began to devalue them. As we talk about, people are proud. We're selfish. And it's kind of in our nature. But what that often means is that I value myself more importantly than all of you. I am Bishop Darby, of course. Therefore, to Bishop Darby is the most important thing in the universe, right? And we have moments in our life that gets shaken. Like for me, it was marriage. Oh, wait a second. Now I'm not just thinking about me. Now I'm thinking about her. Down the line when kids are introduced, that's going to change it again. Because now it's, I have a wife and now I have a kid I have to pour into. It can't just be me. And that forces our brain to change a little bit. That's why I think parents can understand the love of God a lot better than I can. Because they've experienced what it's like to think outside of themselves for someone else. Problem is, in the church, we don't do that well. I would even say that sometimes in the church, we're awesome at loving each other. Right? I think we're pretty good at that. I love you, you love me, it all works out. Problem is, we go outside these doors and that is not what they see. It's not at all what the world sees. We devalue. One of the things that's been really haunting to work with teenagers, sorry guys, I'm going to put you under the bus. One thing that's really hard to work with teenagers is I'm getting a lot of people that are coming from outside the church, that don't have church backgrounds, which is awesome. But man alive, if I had a recorder in that room to hear some of the things they say about the church. They don't mean any disrespect by it. But they ask questions that I think we all have. Well, how come y'all say that y'all love God so much, but every time I go on Facebook, y'all are the ones that are causing the problems? I guess I'm confused here. You guys say that you serve a king of peace, but man, there's no peace. It's really condemning to listen to. The answer I've come up with, the best one I have is, yep, we're trying to get better. We're working on it. But it all starts with this idea of this imbalance of love. Because once we imbalance love and don't allow love to be the center of it all, then everything we add to it, justice, judgment, righteousness, holiness, perfection, obedience, all of these things, anything that enters into that centrality is going to be something that eventually will be used to devalue the other. We don't mean it to, but it will. You live a different life than me, you're not as good. So now I'm going to talk down to you. And I'm going to tell you all the reasons that you're a bad person, right? You disalign with me on this agenda or idea? Well, now, that's because you're bad. I'm right, you're wrong. We lose the fact that, well, we're all loved. We're all equally valued by the value given to us by Jesus. Okay, I got to speed this up. I'm sorry, guys. Okay. This idea is very important. Very important. Because sometimes we think to ourselves that was them and we're different. But as I was going through, maybe like you're going through, as I was listening to those things, there were so many things that hit me right in the forehead over and over again. And it was like every time I would read this, I'd be like, man, I do that. We do that. We look like that. We're acting like that. And it was haunting. What's interesting is that the old covenant was all predicated on love. Guess what? So is the new one. I love this line. Now these three remain. These are the carryovers, right? These are the carryovers from the old law. They are faith, hope, and what? Love. And the greatest of them is love, right? Not only that, Galatians chapter 5, verse 4 through 6. What matters is faith working through love. There is one new commandment, though. Jesus did change it up on us just a bit. He actually made it more difficult. Because it says, I'm giving you a new commandment. Remember, the old law is all about love your neighbor, right? He just nuances that. I want you to love them as much as I love you. Whoa. Tell you what, those dudes I get in Facebook fights with, I don't know if I die on a cross for. That's my problem. Those dudes that I scream at and tell are wrong. The ones that I judge and badmouth behind their back. The ones that I devalue or don't care about. The ones that I ignore or avoid. I'd be hard-pressed to climb on a cross for them. But that's the standard we're held to. Not only that, but if you really think about it, these three ideas are being repeated right in front of our eyes. Just like the Israelites who get lost in their culture and often paint God in their culturally identifiable ways and lose the distinctiveness of what it is to be in Hebrew, so too we do the same thing. If we allow our culture to define our God, then our God is going to start looking a lot more like our culture, and we are going to look no different than the rest of the world. This is a really big deal for us. Because guess what? We are Americans, yes, but we are Christians first, living in America as ambassadors. This is not our homeland. Heaven is our homeland. We're just here on detail. And when we are at our best, the church is at our best, Jesus is our king, and we follow him. And we look like distinctly different than the rest of the world. But here's a personal exercise I went through. I'm going to invite you to go through. Sorry in advance, this one stepped on my toes. Maybe it'll step on yours. Take your name away from your life. Just take your name off of it. Slap it somewhere else. Take someone in your office and put them beside you. And ask, can you tell a difference? For me, there's only 4 people in my office. And Patty's the best of all of us, so. But that idea is really important, right? Because do I look like every other American? Or do I look like someone who has a different king and a different leader? We lose our identity of the loving and the loved and become the condemners and the condemning and the condemners, which makes sense because that flows. Just like in the Old Testament, when we think about our own righteousness, our own holiness, our own rightness of belief, when we are dead set on our convictions, which is good, the problem then comes as we start condemning others for not. The beautiful part about God is that he has taken all condemnation away from us. We don't have to think about it. You know, these passages, do not judge, for you shall be judged. We always throw that around. That's actually a really profound way to live life today. God's doing it for our benefit. You don't have to think about it. I'll judge. You live and love. We love, he judges. But the problem, I think, in the American church is very similar to that of Israel, that we have lost what it means to be loved, so we don't really know how to love others. This is one of the more troubling things, and we've talked about it. We talked about it about 5 months ago, so I won't belabor the point, but the reality is, the law as it stands is very easy. You ready? Here's the law. Love God, love each other. We make it more complex and we hold ourselves to difficult standards. Every time we fall, every time we sin, every time we mess up, every time we make a mistake, we have imbalanced love by judging ourselves, by condemning ourselves, forgetting the power of grace that covers us, even in our darkest moments. And in so doing, we imbalance love and we imbalance it to the world. Are you loved? Do you understand what that means? And are you loving others? Because as soon as you lose your own love, you will start condemning whether or not you know it. It's impossible to avoid. And finally, if we forget the fact that the centrality of Jesus' love is it, then we, like the Israelites, will fall into the same category of devaluing others. The only way that we can give infinite value and worth to people is very simple. You ready for this? Treat them like you've been treated by Christ. Sounds super easy, super duper hard to do. But it's that easy. You want to give value to people. Every time you look at them, see the cross. There was a really powerful short story I read about I don't remember who wrote it. Joy, I'm sorry. Last time I quoted a short story and I didn't have the author, she came up and was like, I wish I knew. I wish I did too. Man, spilling coffee. Anyway, the whole point of the short story goes like this. A kid dies. A child. Has eyes. Bright blue eyes. They take the eyes out of the child and give it to another child who was going blind, an eye transplant. This child died. That child now has sight. The short story is taken from the perspective of the father who hated the person that the child belonged to. They were office rivals. But every single time that he saw that family, all he saw looking back on him was his daughter's eyes. That got me thinking, what if we did that with the cross? What if every single person we looked at, we saw Jesus on the cross looking back at us? What if every single time we talked to someone, what we saw looking back was the bloodied head of our Savior? How would we value them differently? We'd probably value them infinitely more. I'm done. I promise. It all comes down to this. This word mercy here is very interesting in the, nerd alert. This is a Greek iteration of a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is hesed. The word hesed literally means steadfast or covenantal love. Translated mercy in Greek, and some of your translations will translate it that. It's fine. It's a good translation. This is a better one. Steadfast love triumphs over judgment. Every single thing you need to know about God you saw in his nature, right? And his nature was love. That's it, full stop. Because in the nature of God, we all think we want a God who's just. I don't want a God who's just. Because I know what I deserve. And I don't want it. So in the moment of God's justice, it was triumphed by his love for me. What about his holiness? He doesn't want to be around sin. He can't stand it except for when he was in the pillar of smoke and fire, or in the tabernacle, or in the Ark of the Covenant, or in the temple, or came down in the flesh, or gave us his Holy Spirit, because at the end of the day, he valued being with me more than he valued his own reputation. Love triumphed over holiness. And love triumphs over anything you want to throw in there. And that's not just true for the nature of God. It should be true for the nature of Christians. Because, guys, we're not going to convert the world based on our righteousness or how loud we can scream or how good our argumentation is. We don't win on apologetics. We win on love. We show them what it means to be loved. And to a world so devoid of that, that is literally the whole point. I am loved. So are you. Every 500 years, the church collapses. And this is actually true dating back prior to that. Go back and look through the history of Israel. Almost every 500 years, on a dime, something bad happened. Look past that, the year 500. Right around that, the fall of Rome devastated the church. 500 years past that, coming out of the bubonic plague, the church was at its lowest. Then we get to 1500, the Reformation movement. Why? Because the church was falling apart. Here we are. 2000, right along track. The reality is I don't want us to keep making the same mistakes. I don't want us to get lost. What was Martin Luther's whole point? Love, actually. It was that easy. Don't get lost in anything else. But embrace the King of love and show it to your neighbor. The first part of this sermon was an autopsy of a dead kingdom, Israel. The second is a plea to not let it happen to us. God's love triumphs over all. He triumphs over my weaknesses and my sin. He triumphs over yours, and he invites you into salvation. It triumphs over anything the world can throw at us. It triumphs over our mistakes, our failures, our weaknesses, our hate. God's love will win on the end. I just want to be there when it happens. I want to have lived a life experiencing God's love. Because frankly, what else is there? Love and be loved. The entire Bible summarized by that. If there's any way we can help you today, we'll be in the back. Let's stand and sing together.